Hello there! Today I am here to wrap up the first half of my September reading. I haven't read a great deal so far this month, but if you saw my second to last video, you'll know that I have now completed my Goodreads challenge, so I'm not overly bothered about reading a lot each month. I'm kind of gravitating towards longer books and taking my time with things a bit more, which is quite nice because it feels like I've had quite a manic reading year so far. So let's get straight into it. The first book I picked up was Iris Murdoch's The Sea. Now can we firstly have a moment for this gorgeous edition? These are the vintage illustrated editions that they released a few years ago, and they've got French flaps and everything, and they are just absolutely stunning. I think this is probably one of the prettiest, certainly the prettiest paperback I own. Just gorgeous. I bought this a shamefully long time ago, probably about 5-6 years ago now, and I've always wanted to read Iris Murdoch. I felt like she would be an author that I would enjoy, and this is probably the book of hers that I don't know if it's her most famous, but it's certainly the one that I have heard the most about. I believe she won the Man Booker with this when it was released back in the 80s, and at the start of the month me and my partner watched Iris the film, which has got Judi Dench in it. I didn't love the film, I have to say. I thought it was going to be more about writing, and it wasn't as such, but it kind of inspired me to finally get around to this, and I'm really glad that I did. Actually, I did enjoy this. It kind of felt like a blanket, and it was really a comforting read. It was an easy read, but yet it was really well written. So this is about a retired London theatre director called Charles, who moves to, I think it's an unspecified seaside town. I don't think we ever know where it is exactly, but it's quite a desolate place, and it's completely different from his life in London. He doesn't have electricity or even a phone in his cottage, which obviously this was written in the 80s, that wouldn't have been a huge deal, but compared to where he's come from, everyone's a bit shocked that he's suddenly taken this huge transition. And basically we learn early on that Charles has had a string of bad relationships. He's never really been able to commit to any woman, and he's treated women quite horrifically because he's always held a flame for the love that he lost when he was in his 20s, and he's always kind of thought that she was his one. And when he moves to this seaside town, he starts seeing a woman who looks a lot like Hadley, his lost love. He then realizes that it is her, but obviously 30 odd years have passed. They're no longer in their 20s, they're in their 60s, and yet he tries to jump into things the way that they were before. He tries to start going around her house, but she's married, and it kind of starts to cause a bit of a ruckus in her marriage. Obviously her husband isn't happy about this famous theatre director who she used to have a thing with suddenly turning up on their sort of peaceful, quiet doorstep. They're quite reserved, private people, and basically Charles gets it into his head that her relationship is not good for her, that her husband is controlling her, and that she would be much happier if she ran away with him, and it goes from there. It basically is a book about human relationships and misunderstandings in human relationships, the way that we project an image of who we expect people to be without actually always looking and actually seeing who they are or what they actually want. I think it's a fascinating book. It kind of, obviously the lost love aspect and the finding her again and having dedicated his life to finding her again, it put me in mind of The Great Gatsby, and I wouldn't be surprised if the original idea was a kind of germination from The Great Gatsby, but this is obviously a much bigger book, so it goes into the issue much more, and it doesn't just look at the lost love between the two of them and the misunderstandings that are now between the two of them. It also looks at Charles's relationship with everyone in his life, really, and how he has misconstrued things along the way. It's just a fascinating book. I think it's one of those books that perhaps at a different time I might have thought it was a bit too long, because it is very slow and it's very gentle, and it's not plot driven, but it's very character driven, and it looks very intricately at relationships, and I think that's what Iris Murdoch does from what I've heard of her. I would definitely pick up more from her. I did thoroughly enjoy the reading experience of this, and as I say, it was quite an easy read, even though it's quite a thick and well written book. It is literary, but it's an easy literary read, so I would recommend that one. Then I read not such a good book, which was Stephanie Victoire's The Other World It Whispers. I've spoken about this in my non-booktube reviews, which I will link down below if you want to know my thoughts in depth. I won't say too much about this here, other than to say that it did really disappoint me. I think when I finished it I was annoyed, and that was when I made my non-booktube review of it. I think the more distance that I'm getting from it, the more I'm thinking that it's okay. There is 9 stories in here and 3 of them were absolutely fine. I quite enjoyed them, but the other ones annoyed me, and I think what this book does is it tries to jump on the bandwagon of being about fairy tales for the sake of being about fairy tales and kind of putting magical realism in there because it's trendy, and I think that's damaging, and I think ultimately the stories just had no real purpose because of that. I think she's definitely an author to look out for. I only gave this 2 stars though. It kind of frustrated me and I can't say that I would recommend it, sadly. Then I finished the month on the highest of the highs. It is Working Days, The Journals of the Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, edited by Robert DeMott. Now, I can't believe that I didn't know that this book existed. Grapes of Wrath is one of my all-time favourites. I absolutely adored it as a read and I can't wait to reread it. It's probably one of the only books in my life that I wish that I could go back and experience for the first time again because it was just that good. This is a book of the journals that John Steinbeck kept while he was writing The Grapes of Wrath. He wrote it in a very short period of time. He had quite a strict structure that he wanted to stick to so that he could get it finished in, I think, 3 months, perhaps 4. I think he did it in 3 months with only 2 rewrites, which is crazy. But this is basically a journal that he kept to make himself stick to the structure that he'd put and set for himself. So each day before he started writing, he would write a little bit in his journal to remind himself what he needed to do today, and kind of break that barrier of starting to get himself writing. I only found out that this was in existence because it was on a recommended reading list for a writing course I will be doing, which you will hear more about soon. I just can't believe that I didn't know about this. Sadly, I also think it's out of print. I had to buy a second-hand copy. There were no brand new ones on sale, so that's shocking. But also, I've realised off the back of this, when I was adding it to my Goodreads, that there's also a book like this which is letters about when he was writing East of Eden, so that's on the wish list for sure. I adored this. I would say that this is quite a niche book in the fact that it probably wouldn't appeal to you, A, if you're not a writer, and B, if you don't love John Steinbeck. But if you do both of those things, I think this is just, you can't go wrong. It's just wonderful. I think it's really good as well from a writing perspective, and I suppose this is why the writing course recommend it, because it looks at things like how you structure a novel, how you move forward from sort of hard points in your novel, and it just looks really intricately at the writing process. But also it's fantastic because there are points in here, for instance, where most of the time John Steinbeck will start his diary with, "This is not the great book that I intended to write. Alas, I think it's quite mediocre," or things like that, or like he'll be like, "Oh, writing was terrible today. This book is not flowing the way it should. I don't think it's going to sell at all." And you know, it went on to be one of the best books ever written, arguably. So it's just reassuring. I think it shows you that even the most seemingly flawless writers had a really difficult time with their writing. I think it's sad as well, this book is split into 2 parts, so it's the journal while he is writing the book, and then it's a little bit of journal after he's finished the book. Ultimately, the bit at the end does feel a little bit tacked on there, but I'm glad that it's on there because aside from looking at the writing process, this book also looks at how Steinbeck dealt with the popularity of The Grapes of Wrath. I didn't know much about the history of the book, obviously, and this does have sort of sections in between the diary entries sometimes, which give you a little bit of backstory and a little bit of understanding of where he was at and what was happening around the book and around Steinbeck's experience. And I didn't realise that Grapes of Wrath was kind of the government didn't like it. They kind of tried to paint Steinbeck as a liar because he was basically uncovering a hole in their system where these migrants were just completely living in poverty, and obviously the government didn't like that. They didn't want people to know that that was happening, so they tried to paint him as a liar. A lot of people tried to get the book banned. He even expresses fears in here at one point because obviously he made a lot of powerful enemies in writing the book, and he expresses fears about his safety, and it's really sad because while he's obviously having a hard time when he's writing the book, there's much more positivity in the journal entries for that section, whereas the section at the end, he's just completely dejected. And it also looks, I suppose, at popularity and how you deal with the popularity of a book, because John Steinbeck, he had quite a hard time dealing with the money that he got from his writing. And for instance, he buys a massive ranch in this book and he sort of has real difficulty with ownership of land, and how that sort of contradicts his beliefs. And obviously the book he's writing is about severe poverty, and so it looks at how he feels about getting so much and such vast sums of money about a topic where obviously he's talking about people who need a lot of help. And I think a lot of people started sending him letters and asking him for money on the back of it, and it just looks at the whole process of the book and also what can happen if it kind of takes off in a way that you didn't perhaps expect. I would just highly recommend this. As I say, people who don't both love writing and John Steinbeck would probably find this really quite bland, but I adored it and I consumed it and will be coming back to it time and time again. So those are all the books I read this month. As I say, not a great deal, but I'm kind of happy with my progress. Please let me know down below what you've been reading, and I will see you next time. Bye.